Hello and welcome to this video on SAT tips. So I think this video is going to be very helpful to all students who are intending to take the SAT. If you're just starting out with the SAT, I think this is a great video to start to get some tips on how to approach the different sections, so that way you can start to see increases in your scores. Also, if you are a student that is experienced with the SAT, I think this will be a valuable video. You will be able to gain some new ideas of how to approach different sections and start to think about how you want to employ these into your own test-taking strategies. With that said, let's get into it. Great, so let's begin. And we will begin with the first section of the SAT, which is the reading section. And to start us off, let's look at some basic techniques. So first, I advise against reading the questions for each passage beforehand. So I suggest not reading the questions and then turning to the passage. And so some students might think that doing this would, give them good insight into what they should be looking for in the passage. But in my opinion, this distracts you from the reading process. And I say this because if while reading a passage you come across some information that you think is pertinent to a question, since you've already read the questions, your brain might fixate on that information and on that section of the passage, and as you continue to read, you might neglect any other relevant information for that question that shows up later, since your brain has already thought that you found the information needed to answer that question. Because of that, it can lead to some wrong answers and a lack of focus while reading the passage. Second, I say to always read the little blurb about the passage before reading the full passage. So in the picture, it's the little blurb in the green box. And before we read that, reading this blurb can give us some information about the time period of the passage, perhaps the setting, main ideas, stuff like that. So let's just take a look at the example. I'll read it out loud. It says, "This passage is from Lydia Minatoya, The Strangeness of Beauty. The setting is Japan in 1920. Chie and her daughter Naomi are members of the House of Fuji, a noble family." So we actually gain a lot of information by reading this. We know where the passage comes from. We know the setting of the passage, Japan. We know the time period, 1920s. We're introduced to two characters, and we know a little bit about them, that they're members of this noble family. So I think it's always critical to read this. So this example in the picture is from a fiction passage, but for non-fiction passages, we can also learn a lot. Sometimes we can learn where the passage was taken from, and this can give us some insight into the author's opinion on the subject that they're writing about. So, completely hypothetical, but consider this example. If we see a passage was extracted from perhaps a magazine section titled "Why All Restaurants Should Use Plant-Based Alternatives to Meat," then we might start to think that, okay, maybe the author has a favorable opinion on plant-based foods, and that can help us out a little bit while reading the full passage. And now let's talk a little bit about time management. So the reading section is 65 minutes, and there's 5 total passages. So usually there's a fiction passage, and then a couple of non-fiction passages. There's a debate section, which is essentially 2 passages, and then you have to answer questions about each of them individually and together, and then one more passage. So this yields 13 minutes per passage on average, and so because of that, there's some reading approaches that we can take to, deal with this 13-minute time limit. And the first approach is what I call the 10-3 approach. And this is because the approach suggests that you spend 10 minutes on reading the passage and 3 minutes on answering the questions. And I said that this is useful for all passages. This is the technique that I use the most, and I found it to be the most helpful. So let's look at some pros and cons. First, this approach encourages reading closely and pausing if necessary. And I think this is where the 10-3 approach really shines. You have 10 minutes to read the passage. Most of the time, the passages are only like 70, 80 lines. Very rarely do they exceed 100 lines. So 10 minutes is plenty of time for you to read the passage, pause if you need to, reread some previous information, and really let all of the information soak in. And you want to do this so that way you can answer the questions in 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not a lot of time to answer the questions, but there are usually maybe 12, 13 questions per passage. So if we spend 10 minutes to read and very carefully analyze the passage while we're reading, those 3 minutes we won't have to worry about it because we'll be able to answer the questions very quickly. And that's the second bullet point for the prose. Lastly, because we're reading so closely and we're getting so much information, it avoids the need for flipping between the questions and answers. So sometimes when we're reading too quickly, we get to the questions and then we forget some of the information from the passage, so we have to flip the pages back and forth. Not only is that a distraction to other students, but it also wastes a lot of time for you. So this is why I really like the 10-3 approach. The cons, well, if you struggle with paying attention, it can be very challenging to read for 10 minutes. But this is something that you'll have to train yourself to get used to. You'll have to do a lot of practice to train yourself to read such little information in such a long period of time. It can be very difficult at first, but practice makes perfect. And another thing, if you're naturally a fast reader, it can be very difficult to slow yourself down as much as possible. It can feel torturous, but I assure you, if you do this, it will be extremely effective. So let's look at a second approach. This is called the Flipflop Approach. And if we look at the second point, I said that this is useful only for the debate section. So that's the section where you have 2 passages in one, and then you have to answer questions about both passages. You don't have to use this for the debate section. You can use the 10-3 approach. I use the 10-3 approach for the debate section. This is just another thing to think about. So what is this approach? Well, it suggests that you read the first passage carefully, then you go to the questions and you answer all of them relevant to only the first passage. After that, you go back to read the second passage, and then you finish answering the questions. So the prose, well, it's a very organized approach for the debate section. You know exactly what you're doing, very systematic. So the second bullet point, it avoids confusion between the 2 passages. Most of the time, the 2 passages are talking about very similar things, but the authors might have different views on it. So if you go through each passage separately, you'll be able to establish that distinction between the 2 passages. The cons, however, you might forget information from the first passage. So what does this mean? If you use the flip-flop approach, the first thing you'll be doing is reading the first passage. And the last thing you'll be doing are answering questions that either don't involve the first passage or involve both passages 1 and 2. And for those questions that involve both passages 1 and 2, you might forget some information that you had read because that was the first thing that you did. So that can waste a little bit of time. And another thing is that questions are not always organized. Like I said, there's usually like 12 questions or so, and it's not necessary that the first few of those questions will relate to the first passage. So it might take some time to look through the questions and figure out which ones you can answer after reading the first passage. And now we'll look at approach 3, which I call the chill approach. And the reason for that is because the approach suggests that you just chill and read at your own pace, so long as you're staying within the time limits. And this can be used for all passages. So let's look at the pros and cons. It emphasizes comfort while reading. Reading at your own pace, well, it allows you to be comfortable, and that's really important. Secondly, your reading pace has already been established since childhood. You've been reading since you were very young, and you've been reading pretty much every single day of your life since then, whether that be in books or on the internet. And so this is likely the optimal speed that you can read at while still comprehending the information. Now let's look at the cons, and we'll see that they kind of tie in with the pros in some ways. And the first thing is that our reading speed is usually too fast, and we aren't able to comprehend as much information as we would like. Why? Well, when we read stuff, we just read to understand what's going on. We're not reading to answer 15 questions afterwards. So because of that, we should be adopting a slower reading pace for the SAT, where we do have to be answering all of these questions afterwards. Additionally, since we have such a naturally faster reading pace than we should be having, it's much more likely that you'll have to flip back to the passage to answer some questions, and that just wastes time. And lastly, this is my least favorite approach. I found it the least useful and least effective, but again, it kind of comes down to personal preference, but I still really think the 10-3 approach is the way to go. Great, so let's move on to some final reading techniques. First, if you use the 10-3 approach, you have plenty of time to read the passage, and I mentioned this earlier on. So because of this, I highly suggest to pause after every 5 lines or so, maybe after every paragraph, and summarize to yourself what you have read. 5 lines might be a little too few lines, but this is the main aspect of the 10-3 approach. You're taking time to pause and making sure you understand everything that's occurred. And if you didn't, well, you just reread those lines that you didn't understand. You have the luxury of time of reading for 10 minutes, so you should be spending that to understand everything. So read a little, pause, and take some time to summarize to yourself. So secondly, this is more of a very specific tip, but there's almost always a passage related to science in some way, and in these passages, it's helpful if you're critical of certain phrases. So I wrote down 2 here. First is like, so far as is known, or it has often been assumed. So these lines are kind of prompting you to pay attention, and they're leading you into an idea that the author will present that's either widely accepted or well known. And at these points, it's very important to pay attention to see whether the author agrees with that notion or if they disagree with it. And from there, you can continue reading and see how the author supports the argument. So if you see any of these lines or something related to it, you should definitely dial in your attention and pay attention to what's going on. So note-taking is a place of confusion for some students. Oftentimes in school, we're taught to take notes on what we're reading, so that way we have our own notes when we go back to reference the passage. But on the other hand, it's not always super helpful, and we'll look into that at the pros and cons. But like I said, it can be useful to some, but it takes up valuable time, and it's critical that you understand that you do not need to take notes to succeed. While you might think that notes can be a benefit and not a liability at all, it's not needed for you to take notes to succeed. And so let's look into the pros and cons, and maybe that can help you understand whether or not you want to take notes while doing the reading section. So first, the pros. Well, when you take notes, it gives you extra information from when you turn back to the passage. And that can be really helpful because it gives you insight into what you were thinking at the time while reading the passage. Secondly, it forces you to actually comprehend what you read. When you take notes, they should be productive notes. They should not just be random notes here and there. These should be related to what you have read, and it forces you to comprehend. So that's one really great aspect of taking notes. The cons. Well, writing notes takes time, and this is a timed exam, and you should be conscious of the time at all times. That's a lot of times in one sentence. But anyways, it takes time, and that can distract you from what you have read. If it takes plenty of time for you to write notes, you might forget some earlier information in the passage. And that's the second bullet point. Third, it's difficult to optimize the quantity of note-taking. So what do I mean by this? If you take too few notes, that's essentially the same thing as not taking any notes at all. It wouldn't be helpful to you, and it would kind of just be a waste of time. However, if you take too many notes, well then your page gets very cluttered, and when you turn back to the passage, you don't really know what to look at. So it can take a lot of practice to develop that nice balance of note-taking. So hopefully with this you can start to decide whether or not you need to take notes. But again, I'll reiterate, you do not need to take notes to succeed. It is not imperative that you do it. And then some more final reading techniques. First, do not assume anything. And this is in all caps because it's super important that you understand this. Don't assume anything. Just don't do it. And this can be really tricky, especially in the non-fiction passages. That's where I found myself running into this issue the most. If you are familiar with some of the information given in the passage, you might have some implicit biases about the subject that might sway your answer choices. But you have to avoid these biases. You can only use the information given to you. You shouldn't be using any other external thoughts you have about the topic. You should only be using the words on the paper. And if that means you have to flip back to the passage, that's fine. Even if you use the 10-3 approach, it's fine. Because you'll probably know exactly where in the passage to look back to because you spent so much time reading. So, very, very important to remember, don't assume anything. Just use what's given to you. So second is a technique that I think can be really, really helpful. And that's to cover up the answer choices of a question with your hand while reading the question. So, oftentimes you can read a question and think of what the answer is based off of what you have read. Then, once you reveal the answers, you move your hand away, you look at the answer choices and you choose the one that best matches what you've said. And if none of the answers closely resemble what you said, then you can just eliminate some answers that you think are just absurd, and then spend some time thinking about the best answer choices. However, most of the time, as you practice and get better, once you reveal the answers, there's usually one that's a clear match to what you have said. So I think this is a very, very helpful technique. Definitely use it in your practice, and you can even use it on the exam. It's very helpful. So next I'm going to talk about what I call support questions. So these are the questions where they ask you to find the lines in the text that best support your previous answer, and they can be paired with their previous question. And sometimes if you're stuck on the first question, you can look at the next question of finding support, and that can, key you into where you should be looking into the text, and then you can answer both of the questions. Perhaps you can answer the support question first and then go back to the previous question, but they can be paired and they can be used to help each other out. Lastly, there are some questions that almost require you to turn back to the text. Even if you use the 10-3 approach, you should turn back to the text if you come across these questions. And these are the questions that ask you about what an author implies or suggests. These words are asking about what the passage does not explicitly state. You're going to have to go back to the passage, look at some surrounding details of the lines and questions, and then sort of gather for yourself what is the author really trying to convey here. It's not going to be explicitly stated. You're going to have to turn back and make your own opinion on that. So let's take a look at a quick example. Let's look at the picture first and read the question. It says, based on the passage, the author's statement, if a pair consists of two purines, for example, there would not be room for it, lines 29 to 30, implies that a pair, ... So obviously we don't have the passage with us, but that's okay. So looking at the question, it says, based on the passage, and the author's statement implies. So these two phrases encourage us to go back to the passage. And even though they specified the lines 29 to 30 in the passage, we should not go to the passage and just read those lines. We should be reading the surrounding lines. So in this case, maybe lines 25 to 35, but use your own discretion. Don't make the bounds so large that you're reading so much information. You should be focused on the lines they give you and read a little bit outside of that. Great, so that was the first section. Now we'll move on to the writing section. I promise the last few sections will not be as in-depth as the reading section. There was a lot of information given to you. These sections, a little less information. And the reason for that is, for the writing section, it's very algorithmic. So what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, the more you practice, the better you'll get. As you practice, you'll start to gather the patterns that are used, and you'll be able to see questions that sort of repeat themselves in very similar ways. So that's why it comes down to practice. There's so many things that goes into writing and grammar and stuff like that it's very difficult to teach everything. So practice. I also wrote that you should be keeping notes of what you're doing during the writing section, so that way you can pick up on some techniques that you use while taking the test. Like I said, there's so many different topics that can be covered. It's very difficult to teach everything, so take your own notes. But with that said, there are some tips that can be used that can guide you to the correct answer. So this is just based off of a lot of patterns that I've seen, and hopefully they help you out. So first, the shortest answer is usually the best. Now, shortest does not mean length of the answer necessarily. It could mean that, but shortest could also mean the simplest, the one that uses the least amount of words. It's usually the best answer. Not always, usually. Second, apostrophes show possession. There's not much to that. If you are confused about apostrophes, I suggest doing some Google searches about how apostrophes are used. That should really help you out. So oftentimes you'll come across questions where you have to decide between an apostrophe S or just an S. So that's deciding between possession or plural. So knowing that apostrophes show possession can be really helpful. Another thing, less punctuation is usually better. Again, not always, just usually better. There's not much to say about that, just something to keep in mind. Another thing, commas can be tricky. In my opinion, they're one of the most difficult punctuation marks. Again, that might not be true for everyone, that's just my opinion. And so one way you can approach this is to read the sentence out loud and see where you naturally pause. And where you naturally pause is likely where you should be placing commas. Don't just go off of where you naturally pause. You should be using a little bit more of your discretion and critical thinking, but it is a good tool to help you decide where to place commas. And then lastly, semicolons. They're very similar to periods. If you're familiar with grammar and the clauses before and after semicolon are both independent clauses. This means that they can stand alone as their own independent sentences. So that can be really helpful in deciding whether or not you need a semicolon. So let's look at a quick example. I'll read it out loud. So it says, yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, and government officials are also working together to develop additional solutions for reducing whey. And if we look at question 4, the words that are underlined, we're choosing between different types of punctuation. So I'll read the sentence out loud again and see where I naturally pause. Yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, and government officials are also working together to develop additional solutions for reducing whey. So I naturally paused after the word manufacturers and scientists. So I'm starting to think that, okay, there is definitely a pause after the word scientists, but I didn't pause after the word and. So I'm thinking there isn't a punctuation mark after the word and. So because of that, I'm sort of eliminating choice D. Choice B is not correct. We didn't talk about colons, but it's not the correct answer. And then between A and C, well, if we look at A, we know semicolons, there must be an independent clause before and after it. So if we look before it, the clause is yogurt manufacturers, food scientists. That's not an independent clause, it's not its own standalone sentence, so we can't use a semicolon. So choice C is likely our best answer, and if we see, they just put a comma after the word scientists, and that is where I naturally paused. So that we should be feeling quite confident about that answer. Okay, so we'll move on to some more basic techniques. First, you should always be cognizant of tone. In every exam, there's usually 2 or 3 questions where you have to decide between tone, and oftentimes you have to choose the best word or words for a sentence, and that comes down to judgment of tone. So let's look at the picture. The sentence says, "Even those of us who work in disparate fields are able to share advice and help each other brainstorm." So it's kind of difficult to answer this question because we don't have the context of the passage to see the tone that was used previously and afterwards. But let's just look at the answer choices. Answer choice B is give some wisdom, and answer choice D is opine. Very different tones that are given off. So if we read the rest of the passage, we can sort of be able to tell whether or not we need a more formal word such as opine here, or if it's more casual, like give some wisdom. Another thing is to look out for answer choices that have redundant information. These answers are usually, almost always, wrong. So let's look at the example. The novelty of this comfortable work-from-home life, however, soon got worn off quickly. So let's look at the answer choices. And the first one, soon got worn off quickly. We have the word quickly already in the sentence, and soon is pretty much a synonym to quickly. So that's kind of a redundant word in there. If we look at choice B, was promptly worn off quickly, again, promptly and quickly are synonyms, so it will be another redundant word. Choice C, promptly wore off quickly, same thing, redundancy. D, wore off quickly. It's short, it's simple, there isn't any redundancy. I would go with answer choice D. And lastly, some more techniques. First, you should be studying your transition words and know what they mean. It's very common that you'll see questions where they underline a word at the start of a sentence or paragraph, and these words, for example, are therefore, for example, moreover, etc. So you should know what these transition words mean. You should be able to analyze the sentence or sentences before the transition and after the transition, see how they relate to each other, and from there choose the appropriate transition word. I'm sure if you do a Google search you can read all about different transition words, but it's very important to be familiar with these. Additionally, you should be familiar with your verb tenses. There are questions where they'll usually underline a verb, and the answer choices will be the verb in different tenses. And for these questions, I suggest looking at the rest of the passage, looking at some other verbs that were used, and then choosing the answer that matches the tense of those other verbs. And that should guide you towards the correct answer. And lastly, for questions that ask you about sentence placement, like where is the best place to put this sentence, analyze all of the surrounding sentences. Maybe underline some keywords in each sentence and sort of see where the sentence in question matches other sentences. Okay, so that wraps up the writing section, and now we'll go into the math section. I wrote section 3 and 4 because there's 2 math section parts, the calculator and non-calculator, but for this presentation they're going to be grouped into one. So first, you really need to know your stuff. There's not really a way around it. Math is so vast, they can ask you so many different things, you just gotta know your stuff. And the formula sheet that they provide to you, it's very short, and that's good and bad. It's good because you can memorize it and avoid ever having to flip back to it, but it's bad because it's not so much information. So maybe memorize it if you haven't already, and yeah. Second, be very familiar with slope. I think there's usually 5 or 6 questions about slope in every exam. You should be able to know how to calculate slope. You should know what slope means, that it's a measure of the rate of change. And you should be very familiar with slope-intercept form in equations, meaning that you should be able to create your own equation in slope-intercept form, and you should be able to detect an equation that is in that form and know what each part of that equation means. The SAT always likes to ask word questions about slope-intercept equations, and you'll see this maybe 2 or 3 questions in every exam. So it's very important that you understand slopes, so that way you can always get these questions right. Sometimes it's a good idea to use answer choices to answer the question. And I said to not do this all the time because it's not a good habit to do it. But in some instances, maybe you're pressed on time, or solving the question would just be too chaotic and you're concerned about making a mistake. Sometimes you can just plug the answer into the question and see if there's some sort of equality that forms, and that can help you out. So again, don't always do this. It's quite unhealthy to do it, but sometimes it can be very helpful. And then next, understand how to multiply polynomials. This occurs sometimes that you do need to know this, maybe 1 or 2 questions every exam. So I wrote the word FOIL, that's the word that's used in my neck of the woods. It might be different elsewhere, but I'll do a quick example. So this is when we have like x plus 2 times x plus 3, and you should be able to know how to multiply this. So FOIL stands for first, outer, inner, last. So first is the first term, so we multiply those two and we get x squared. Outer is the outer terms, so that's 3x. Inner is these 2 terms, so that's 2x. And then last is the last 2 terms, so that's plus 6, multiplying them. And if we simplify this, we get x squared plus 5x plus 6. So you should be able to do this and be very comfortable with it. Last is to study your triangles. Triangles are the most common geometric figure that you'll see in the exam. You should be able to do the Pythagorean theorem. You should be able to detect similar triangles, know when 2 triangles are similar, what properties do they have that makes them similar. And you should be able to calculate sine, cosine, and tangent. It's not very common that we'll see trig on the exam. Again, maybe 1 question every exam, but if you do know this, it can be really helpful. I'll quickly demonstrate. So if we have a triangle that's a right triangle, that's a really bad triangle. So that's a right triangle, and we have an angle theta. This side here is called the opposite side. This is the adjacent side, and this is the hypotenuse. So sine of theta corresponds to opposite over hypotenuse, cosine of theta equals adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent of theta equals opposite over adjacent. So be familiar with that, know how to solve questions that involve that. Again, it's not super common we'll see this, but it is helpful to know. And so here's a quick example. Let's read the question. Kathy is a repair technician for a phone company. Each week, she receives a batch of phones that need repairs. The number of phones that she has left fixed at the end of each day can be estimated with the equation P equals 108 minus 23D, where P is the number of phones left and D is the number of days she has worked that week. So what is the meaning of 108 in this equation? So if we're familiar with slope-intercept form, we would know that this equation, P equals 108 minus 23D, is in that form, where negative 23 is the slope and 108 is the intercept. And this question asks about what 108 means in concept, and 108 is the intercept. So if you're familiar with this form, you know that the dependent variable will be equal to the intercept when the independent variable is 0. So in this case, P equals 108 when D equals 0. And you can plug D equals 0 into here, and you see that P equals 108. So what does that mean in context of the question? Well, P is the number of phones left that we marked here. So, and D is the number of days she's worked that week. So we can start to formulate an answer. We think that like when she has worked 0 days at the start of the week, there's 108 phones left. And if we look at the answer choices, that's answer choice B. So be familiar with this form, and this is a really good word problem example that you'll see very, very often. And then some more specific tips. These won't show up all the time, but if you know them, it's good to know. First, a function will be undefined when its denominator is 0. So sometimes there's a multiple choice question where they give you a function and they ask where is this undefined. You just solve for when the denominator is 0. Next, know your fundamental equations for different graphs. Circles, parabolas, and lines are the most common that you'll see. You should be able to establish an equation from a graph and graph from an equation. So you should be able to do those interchangeably and know what these fundamental equations look like. Also, be comfortable with imaginary numbers. Again, this maybe shows up once every exam. You should know how to add and subtract them, but maybe be familiar with multiplication. I don't recall ever seeing multiplication, but it is still something helpful to know. So there's an example here. For I equals the square root of -1, what is the sum? 7 plus 3i plus -8 plus 9i. For these questions, it's very similar to adding with variables. You just group like terms. So first we add 7 and -8 are like terms, so we'll group those together. And then 3i and 9i are like terms, so we can group those together. And then if we simplify this turns out to be -1. And this turns out to be 12i, and that's our answer. Also, you should be able to form your own equation for word problems, so this goes back into the slope-intercept form that I was talking about. There are word questions where they encourage you to form an equation of the line, then answer some more specific questions. So let's look at this example. The cost of using a telephone in a hotel meeting room is 20 cents per minute. Which of the following equation represents the total cost C in dollars for H hours of phone use? So we don't have the answer choices, but we can still come up with an equation. So C is the total cost, and that seems to depend on the amount of time we spend on it. So we'll say C is the dependent variable. And H hours, but we're given 20 cents per minute, so let's convert H hours to minutes. So there's 60 minutes in 1 hour, so there's 60 times H minutes in H hours, and then that we just multiply by 0.20 to get how much it costs in dollars. If this example was too quick, that's okay. This is just to show that you should be able to create an equation from a problem. And lastly, the math section covers a lot of topics, and it's very hard to specify everything that will be on it and guarantee stuff that will be on it. So for the math section, again, it comes down to a lot of practice. You'll be able to see what kind of problems show up a lot, and from that, figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then focus on your weaknesses. Great, so that brings us to the end of this presentation. Again, I wish you good luck. Wishing you all of the best. Hopefully this video gave you some inspiration into what you should be looking for when taking the exam. Hopefully you gained some new ideas of how to approach the different sections. And again, if there were some more specific things that you would like me to cover, please let me know. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful. And again, good luck and all the best.